Hello friends, welcome back to Boots and Bounty Homestead. So we are gathering along information on the journey for homesteading for free. We are focusing on the garden right now since this is what everybody's doing right now, is the gardening season. So we have talked about wood chips to be used all over. We have talked about soil, we have talked about mulch, we have talked about weed barriers. Oh my goodness guys, if you missed all of that, make sure you go back and watch it. So now that we have progressed into me showing you ways to build your garden beds from scratch, or maybe to evolve some of your already planted or planned out garden beds to use some different methods, now we have to look at fertilizing them. So when we first start talking about fertilizers, we need to look at nature. How does nature do it? Nature covers its ground with mulch. Mulch decomposes. It makes better topsoil. And it feeds down into the earth. Roots grow down into the earth, get the nutrients, send it back up to the top, and then it falls back down. It's like one big circle. One big circle. So let's recreate that in the garden. You see a lot of YouTubers and a lot of people, a lot of stuff in the stores that talk about all kinds of things. Talking about NPKs and talking about bone meal and fish emulsion, and it just turns into so much. Then comes the debate of commercial fertilizers versus organic fertilizers. Oh my gosh, it can be so confusing. Well, you know what? You can make them at home. I'm going to show you how. So first of all, there are short-term and there are long-term fertilizers. What you want to do in the long run is to build your gardens where they're going to feed themselves, basically. So as you are planning out maybe some new garden beds, or maybe you want to kind of redo what you're doing, instead of going from if you have till beds, maybe you want to get to the no-till method. If you're a new homesteader, a new gardener, and you don't have the equipment to, you can do no-till beds. Just like us. I mean, we have almost 6 acres here and we don't own a tractor. The only equipment we use is a lawnmower. That's not going to do much for the garden. So that's why I want to bring you these ways to doing things maybe in a smaller situation, and that's budget friendly. As you are building your garden beds, think about fertilizer as you're building those garden beds. And what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of times you want to have certain beds, you want to have certain walkways, you've got to have your food accessible. So one, why not make it aesthetically pleasing, as well as functional, as well as fertilizing? So gardening is not usually a first year item. It's not usually something that you are just going to go in and just bam, beautiful. It takes time. It takes time to age. It takes time to get to this point. So I want to start in the very beginning on building your beds, and that way it can feed your garden for years to come. Now, what am I talking about? Okay, so we've talked about the weed barriers, and that's a type of carbon fertilizer. We've talked about wood chips, I'm going to touch on later, as mulch, different kinds of mulch. Those actually act as fertilizers. I'll touch on that in a little bit. But as starting out building your beds, think about using other items, natural items, as in rocks. Rocks are made of minerals, right? They erode over time. So rocks you can actually use to outline your beds, make pretty walk paths, use them as decoration in your garden. But they also are used as a form of fertilizer. They will feed all kinds of minerals and nutrients into your garden over tens of 20s of years, even hundreds sometimes. And that's going to be just a long-term fertilizer. Another form of kind of a longer term fertilizer would be like logs. You can use big untreated logs, landscaping logs that are untreated, trees that fell, whatever. any kind of big logs, you can use those as the edges of your bed. You can use those to create those walk paths. You can use them like put a tree trunk up in your garden and hang some decorative stuff from it. But you're also going to fertilize your garden. A lot of times you hear people refer to hugelkultur beds. That's not my favorite method, but it is possible. And that's another way that you put those logs and those limbs and sticks on the bottom, and as they decompose, it turns into soil and fertilizes that bed that you're using it in. I did those at my last home. I'm no longer doing those just because it decreases in amount so fast and so much that I had to keep refilling my beds. It's not my favorite. So instead, you can actually, like I said, create the edges of your beds or walk paths, or even use them as decor in your beds to create that long-term fertilizer and still use them in your beds. What rocks and logs also do is bring in extra life that you need inside your garden. So if you pick up a rock, if you move a log, what do you see under it? You see all kinds of little squirmies and crawlies and all kinds of good stuff. Logs also grow mushrooms and fungi that bring those beneficial items to your garden that's also going to break down and fertilize your garden as well. Those moist spots underneath those logs and those rocks bring in those worms, the grub worms, the earthworms, all that good stuff. Even little ants, the little black ants that are beneficial to your garden as pollinators, as aerators, as even creating compost and feeding your garden. So now that you've got your beds made, you can use the cardboard boxes as weed barriers. That breaks down and fertilizes the garden as well, turns into rich soil later, over about 6 months or so. Then you think about the soil that you put in your garden, which I touched on what we use, and some other options for you guys to use as free soil in your garden. Then comes the mulch. So, as I'm talking about layering your garden and building it, everything you use, you want to think about as a fertilizer over time, creating this beautiful mass in your garden that's going to grow things for years and years and years to come. Okay, so then we're going to talk about mulch. Mulch is always used as fertilizer. So as it rains, that is what decomposes, and that's what washes down all of the minerals. So you can go back and watch my mulch video. I give you some ideas there. But let's talk a little bit in depth about each item that I'm going to lightly touch on a few things. So of course we've got wood chips. That's going to take 2 to 3 years to break down. That's going to give you the most benefit over time as mulch, and it's slower to break down as fertilizer, so it does last longer. Some other things we use around here you're going to see is we use our pine needles. Now our pine needles have been decomposing in our little forest of trees back there, and it has already started creating those benefits as in the fungi and the worms and the bugs and all that good stuff. So as we are scooping it up and placing it on our garden, it's just taking those benefits with it. And the pine needles, they take a good amount of time to break down. I'm going to say about a year or so, if not longer. So I'm not working myself to death to try to replace that mulch as often. Another thing you can use would be also leaves. Now with leaves, think about it this way. The trees are pulling everything out of the ground, sending it up through the trees and out to the leaves. The leaves collect all this goodness that is coming from the earth, and it falls. So all you need to do is scoop it up and put it back on your garden, and you get all of those benefits from the earth that comes out and you put on your garden. So the leaves are feeding your garden. They don't take as long to break down, but it depends on how fast you need them to break down. You can mulch them up and go ahead and just sprinkle them all over. Make sure you wet them down real good, or you can leave them whole. If you leave them whole, they do like compact and stick together, and there's not as much aeration in there. So you're not going to get that full breakdown, and sometimes it can even like make a mat and can stop the flow of air. So make sure that you kind of move those around as they break down. And then the last one in this little section I'll talk about is going to be some kind of animal clean out, like your barn clean out, your chicken coop, anything like that. I touched on this in the mulch one, talking about how we take our wood chips, put them in the chicken run, let the chickens kind of compost on them and fertilize them. We scoop it out, putting on our garden, and then as the rain comes down, it washes that nitrogen down into the soil, and then we're left with wood chips to further decompose. This also works with hay or straw, any kind of coverage like that, pine shavings. All of that is going to do double duty, as in fertilizing your soil, as well as you can use it as mulch. And then therefore the mulch is still going to be a longer term of fertilizer for your garden. Another double duty item is grass clippings. That also provides fertilizer, and it also provides mulch. So you can take your grass clippings, and I would really advise them not to be seeded. If your yard has went to seed, you're basically putting those seeds in your garden. So please be careful with that. You can also use those grass clippings in your garden as mulch, and then as they break down, that will be your green for nitrogen, and as they break down, it provides the carbon aspect. Okay, in the end of my last video where I talk about mulch, I kind of hit on the subject I'm fixing to cover just a little bit. And it seemed to click with a lot of people. They're like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that? So here's where I'm going to touch on that in a little bit more depth. If you think about all these older videos, let's just say Little House on the Prairie or something like that, as you're going back and you're watching the videos, they try to make it as close as possible. If you look at historical pictures in books and different things like that, one thing you don't see are compost bins. Okay? Think about that for a second. Why do we not see compost bins? Well, first of all, we didn't have factories back then that made them. But what did they do instead? You know, they didn't have a whole lot of money back then. So how did they make their own compost? Well, I'm going to tell you. So instead of making these massive piles, which you can do that. If you want a big production, you can do that. That's fine. But instead of making these big piles of green and brown and all this and all that and water it and temperature and all, you don't have to. You can do a continual compost bin style gardening. I guess we're going to call it that. Compost bin style gardening. Whereas you're going to build your gardens and make your gardens to where they compost themselves. What you're going to do is, after you get your garden beds built with whatever materials you are going to create them with, you're going to use the seasons to help you make your own compost. And what I mean by that is, in the spring, you got your greens. So you're going to be doing all of your lawn clippings, any like tree limbs that are green, that have leaves on them, anything like that. That's your greens part for your nitrogen. And then as you move along through the summer, your plants die. If they're not diseased, you can go ahead and just lay them down. That's going to be kind of a green and a brown. And then as you transition into the fall, that's when you start turning into your browns. So that's where you got your leaves. And that's where you're going to compost your browns for your carbons. As you're changing from greens to browns and you're layering this, it's all breaking down and acting as fertilizer. And it is composting. It is decomposing. It is creating great soil that you are going to be using throughout your gardening season. Another level to throw in there are your kitchen scraps. Now, I talked about plants where you throw them down and they compost in place. It's kind of the same thing for kitchen scraps. So with kitchen scraps, you are going to get more minerals than just the NPK kind of thing. You're going to throw in your banana peels. You're going to throw in your eggshells. You're going to throw in any kind of fruits or vegetables, preferably not with seeds unless you can help it, because that can give you volunteer plants. And if that's something you're okay with, then throw it all out there. Just don't put any grease or oils or fats or anything like that in your garden, because that it doesn't break down like plant material. So all we're wanting to put out there is plant material. In turn, what that's going to do, along with breaking down your greens and your browns, it's actually going to feed the worms and the bugs. So they are going to come out of the earth that, you know, they're down in the dirt, soil, whatever you want to call it. They're down beneath your garden, and they're going to come up and they're going to feed on these scraps, which is in turn going to break down, which is in turn going to give you the worm castings, which is in turn going to make good compost and fertilize your garden. Over time, it is going to turn into something beautiful. So don't get all caught up in the analysis paralysis of watching all these YouTubers and on Pinterest. How do I make my compost bin cute? How do I do it? Don't worry about all that. Just throw it out in your garden. Because like I said in my last video, God's been doing this a lot longer than you have. Speaking of which, you can learn a lot from nature. Because really, do you see anybody going around the whole world fertilizing it? Do you see anybody walking around with a bucket throwing fertilizer out there, helping these trees grow, helping the grass along the ditches grow? Do you see anybody doing that? No. God created the earth to take care of itself. So we have to get back to our roots, and we have to learn how to do it. We don't need all these commercial items. We don't need all of these factories. Yes, people need jobs. I understand that. I'm not going there because I have a job. But when you are really on a budget, this is how you cut out that middleman, and this is how you get back to nature. God has created everything to take care of itself. We have to step back and let it do its thing. We can't jump in there in the middle of it and start messing the balance up, because that's where it gets crazy. So speaking of balance, let's hit the high points of what you normally see. So you see NPK on fertilizers. Let me tell you what that means. N is for nitrogen. That's what grows the plant. If you have a plant that grows big and lush and has a lot of greenery and doesn't produce a whole lot of fruit or vegetables, you got too much nitrogen. But you do need nitrogen in order to grow the plant. P is for phosphorus. This is what's going to grow your root vegetables. This is what's going to grow the roots of your plant. It's also going to help create the blooms. That's going to create the fruit. The K, just like on the periodic table, is for potassium, or what some people refer to as potash or potash. Potash or potassium, K. That's what's going to be just an overall general well-being of your plant, but mostly to help the blooms and the fruits. This is what's going to create the actual fruits or vegetables to be produced on a plant, okay? So now, don't get too consumed on NPK. Let me show you how to make, or let me tell you how to make an overall healthy garden from foods you eat. So we're talking about free fertilizer. You have to eat, right? So you have to eat. Your garden technically has to eat. But why don't you use your food waste to create fertilizer? So let's talk about N for your nitrogen. This is usually your greens that you're going to put down, the plants, compost in place, any lawn clippings, anything like that. That's your nitrogen. But in a quicker sense, instead of laying plants down and letting them decompose, let's make a liquid. So one thing you can use is fish. Any kind of fish that you caught, any kind of fish bones maybe you have left over, any kind of canned fish like mackerel or salmon or tuna, anything like that. What we're going to do is make a fish emulsion liquid. What that means is we are going to make a pourable solution that you can put on your garden, and it's all from cheap materials or the leftovers from foods that you eat. Now, I never understood why my daddy did this, but he always has a huge barrel out by where he cleans fish, and it always stunk to high heavens. God forbid the wind get a hold of that and blow it where you're standing, because it is rank. Absolutely stinks. And this is going to be no exception. So the easiest method to do is get a bucket, throw your fish and bones and whatever in it, and fill it up with water. Now, unless you have a very big significant amount, you would want to use maybe a 1 or 2 gallon bucket, not a 50-gallon drum, but just 1 or 2 gallons. And then just kind of throw your scraps in there and just let them sit. Now, this may take a week or two to start making a really good fertilizer, but the longer it sits, the more concentrated it gets. So if it's something that you make or create for a long amount of time, you might want to consider diluting it a little bit so you don't burn your plants up. But this is going to be the best way to get your nitrogen. Now, if you want to do all this research, I'll go ahead and tell you what you're going to find online. You're going to find recipes that say to add molasses. You're going to see recipes that say add some kind of brown component. Those are not necessarily necessary. You can do those if you want. Molasses is going to give other benefits, and you can do your own research on that. You can just leave the bucket sitting outside and let the leaves fall in it. You can walk by and throw some green leaves or something in it. And what you're initially making is just a tea, a form of a compost tea. So how are you going to use this to fertilize your garden? What you want to do is, like my dad, he has an old metal coffee can, and he just goes by, dips it down in there, pulls it out, and then just, goes down through the middle of his plants and just waters them, basically. So that would be a little more diluted solution. If you want to make a little more concentrated solution, then you would want to make it to where, I can't give you a ratio because I don't know the amounts that you're using, but just say a 1-to-4 ratio. So if you want to use like 1 cup to 4 cups of water or something like that, or maybe a quart to a gallon, just say something like that, then that would be sufficient. Just look for signs that, your plants are showing you that they are going to be needing some kind of nitrogen. Most of the time the leaves are going to kind of start losing their color, or some get spots on them or whatever. So, that'll be your sign that you may need to make it a little more stronger or feed them a little more often. So that's going to cover most of your nitrogen benefit for free, or at least a low budget. Now let's move on to phosphorus, which is the P in the NPK. So phosphorus is what's going to feed your roots, your root vegetables, your roots of your plants, and create the blooms for the plants that produce above ground. So for your phosphorus, this is where it gets fun, in the kitchen. All right, so you guys, I'm sure you eat chicken, I'm sure you eat turkey, any kind of beef, anything like that. What we're going to make with it is bone meal. And how you make that is you're going to save those bones. After you cook whatever you're cooking that has bones in it, you need to save those bones. After you de-meat the bones, you're going to take the bones, and you can do several different options to your comfort level. You can put the bones in an Instapot and just cover them with water. You can put the bones in a pressure canner or pressure cooker and cook the bones. Now, probably about 2 hours or so, keeping it about 10 pounds. If you use a pressure canner or pressure cooker, it'll be about 10 pounds. In an Instapot, it's 10 to 12 pounds normally, but a lot of them don't have that reading on it. I'm just telling you. Usually they're 11 to 12 pounds. And you want to do this for a couple of hours. Once the bones get through cooking, you will have a delicious bone broth that you can take off, and you want to save the bones. Now, if you're not comfortable with using some kind of pressurized device, you can just put the bones in a stock pot that has a very thick bottom, fill it up with water, put the top on it, simmer it up to 48 hours. Sometimes it may be a little bit longer depending on the thickness of the bone. Sometimes it may be a little bit less. So that's where you're going to have to test them. So to test the bones, what you're looking for is for them to easily break apart. Like, you can either take a fork and just kind of poke them and they bust apart. You can take scissors and just snip them and they break apart. You just want these to fall off the bone. So then after you cook your bones, what the heck are you going to do with them? So there are 2 different ways you can do the next step. You can either dehydrate them first, or you can put them in the oven and bake them to dehydrate them. You want it to be about 150, 200 degrees for several hours, and you're just going to have to eyeball it to see how dry your bones are getting. So you can either dry your bones out first and then put them in like a blender or something to make a powder, or you can powder them first, or you can grind up your bones, spread them out on a sheet or in your dehydrator, and then dehydrate them that way. Sometimes that step is going to take an additional step of blending them after you dehydrate the ground up bones, just to make sure they get fine enough for you to be able to put them on your garden. So that's an easy way on how to make bone meal, and that's what's going to feed the roots of your plants and get them a good and healthy start on your garden. And the last one we're going to talk about real quick is potassium, or K, or potash, or potash, however you want to say it. So potassium, where do you get potassium from? When somebody says, oh, my leg's cramping, you need potassium, what do you do? You eat a banana, right? Well, that's what we're going to feed our garden. You eat bananas for potassium, we're going to give our garden bananas for potassium. But you're going to get the goodness of the banana fruit, and they're going to get the goodness of the peel. So you can do this several ways as well. You can, if you're composting in place, just throw the darn thing out there and just let it do its thing. Worms will break it down. It'll take a little bit longer, and it'll feed it a lot slower. If you're looking for a little bit of a quicker option, you can actually just make a compost tea. Throw your banana peels in a small bucket or a bowl, cover it with water, and then just let it sit for a week or two. It's going to get stinky, it's going to get nasty, but you can use that liquid and pour it onto your garden, and it'll soak it right up. And that's a quick way to feed your garden potassium. Sorry, my battery died. Okay, so we were talking about the bananas. Okay, so one other thing you can do, like I said, the last part would be like you did the bone meal. And that's going to be to lay them out, let them either dehydrate in a dehydrator, let them lay out in the sun. You can stick them in the oven, just barely warm, and just let them dry out until they're crispy. Then you can put them in a blender and then spread them on your garden. As they, rehydrate and get watered, that powder is going to create that, basically that water, the compost tea, and that is going to in turn feed your plants the potassium that it is looking for. Well guys, I know this video is a little bit longer than my other homesteading for free, but there are so many options that you can use to building your garden. And basically that's what you want to do. You want to create a garden that's going to feed itself. And there are going to be times where you're going to need some of those more immediate fertilizers. Like if your plants start showing those signs that they need extra minerals, then you do have ways that I've showed you here where you can provide those nutrition and the fertilizer for those plants for whatever reason they may be lacking in some of those areas. Now, with this being said, this process does take a few years to accomplish. If you are doing a garden that is going to be one of these self-rejuvenating, self-feeding, self-fertilizing compost gardens, basically what it is, like I said, the compost bin gardening method, if you want to do something like that, that does take a while to get started. But you can always do supplemental feedings from those organic fertilizers that you do purchase at the store. You can get triple 10, triple 13, even triple 15 if you want. And if you're doing, it doesn't matter. The food is food. You can either buy it commercially or you can get it organically. That's totally up to you, up to your garden preference, whatever you want to use. So you can do the supplemental feedings as needed for whatever your garden needs are until you can get that established. But guys, I really hope this gives you some kind of inspiration to do your self-sustainable gardening in a way that is self-sustainable, in a way that you can do it from nature, in a way that you can do it to where it's going to take care of itself, because that is the way that God intended us to live on this earth and to create our food. It was created that way. It was created to produce, to reproduce, to take care of itself. It doesn't need us. Literally, plants do not need us. If they are in nature, nature takes care of itself. It's when we take it out of its environment and put it in a garden where it only has limited resources that it does need us. So think about that. If you want to make it to where your plants don't need you to take care of it as much and get it back to nature, you're going to have to give it nature. You're going to have to provide it in a way that nature provides to its plants, to its trees, to its grass, to its weeds, you know, flowers. Everything that you see does not need your help. So try not to take your garden too far away from nature that it will have to depend on you. Guys, I really hope this helps you. If you have any questions, any suggestions, if you have anything that you do that provides a different level of fertilization to your plants, shoot it down below. Let's learn together. Let's share our valuable information, because knowledge is priceless. If you do some research and you find some different things, let me know down below, because I'm always curious to see what other people learn, what other people do, what other people use. We can all learn together and help each other out. So guys, until next time, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it helps you to build a wonderful garden to feed you and your family, and hopefully even some friends. I hope you have enough to share with friends and just give it away or sell it or share with the world. So until next time, guys, we will see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.